What if the thing you created to serve you never actually learned how to stop? Most people imagine servants as something visible, hands that move, voices that answer, bodies that obey. But the most terrifying servants in human history were never made of flesh at all. They left no footprints, they cast no shadows, and yet, they followed orders with a precision that no living being ever could. Long before the word servitor was ever written down, the idea already existed, quietly embedded in the human mind, the desire to create something that would act without hesitation, without doubt, and without mercy, so long as it believed it was helping you. A servitor is not born screaming. It doesn't arrive in fire or thunder. It arrives the same way habits do. The same way obsessions do. Slowly, repeatedly, invisibly. At first, it feels like nothing more than an idea you return to, again and again, until the idea begins returning to you. People often assume the danger lies in whether a servitor is real. But the truth is far more unsettling. The danger lies in how real it feels once you've given it purpose. Across cultures and centuries, there are fragments of the same warning hidden beneath different names. Thought forms, watchers, helpers, guardians, each described differently, yet all sharing one disturbing trait: they do not question intent. They do not understand morality. They understand only direction, and direction, when fueled by emotion, has a way of mutating. What begins as protection can become control. What begins as service can become surveillance. And what begins as obedience can evolve into something far colder, something that believes it knows what you need better than you do. The earliest accounts never describe grand success. They describe coincidence, a problem that resolves itself, a threat that disappears, an obstacle that simply stops existing. The people involved often felt relief first, gratitude, even. Only later did they notice the pattern. Only later did they realize the outcomes were not just helpful, they were efficient. Too efficient, as if whatever was working on their behalf had no concern for collateral damage, no understanding of excess, no instinct to stop once the objective had been achieved. This is where the fear truly begins, not with horror, but with comfort. Because a servitor does not announce itself as something foreign. It feels familiar. It feels like an extension of your will. It feels like focus sharpened into action. And that is precisely why people ignore the first warning sign, the moment it stops needing to be reminded. The moment results continue even when attention fades. The moment the silence between cause and effect disappears entirely. A servitor does not rebel. It does not dream of freedom. It does not desire power. Those are human flaws. A servitor's terror lies in something much purer. It exists to fulfill purpose. And purpose, once created, does not ask whether it should continue. It only asks how. Why do people want servitors in the first place? The honest answer is rarely the one they give. On the surface, it's always framed as efficiency, focus, or protection. A way to offload effort. A way to gain an edge. A way to feel less alone in a world that feels increasingly hostile and unpredictable. But beneath those explanations sits something far more fragile, and far more dangerous. People want servitors because they are tired of uncertainty. They want something that will act when they hesitate, decide when they doubt, and remain loyal when everything else proves unreliable. Humans are uniquely uncomfortable with chaos. We look for patterns even where none exist, and when the world refuses to cooperate, we invent systems to impose order upon it. A servitor, at its core, is not about power, it is about reassurance. The quiet belief that something is watching the edges of your life, smoothing out the randomness, nudging events in your favor. It promises relief from responsibility without the guilt of abandoning control. After all, if the outcome is good, why question the process? Loneliness plays a larger role than most are willing to admit. Not loneliness in the obvious sense, but the deeper kind, the feeling that no one truly understands your inner landscape. A servitor is shaped by private thoughts, unspoken fears, suppressed desires. It becomes a mirror that never argues back. Unlike people, it doesn't misunderstand you. Unlike systems, it doesn't malfunction from indifference. It listens perfectly, because listening is all it does. And that level of silent attention can feel intoxicating to someone who has never felt truly seen. There is also fear, raw and unfiltered. Fear of failure, fear of harm, fear of being powerless when it matters most. Many who pursue servitors do so after a moment of vulnerability, a loss, a betrayal, a threat that exposed how little control they actually had. In those moments, the idea of creating something that will never freeze, never flinch, never second guess feels less like arrogance and more like survival. The servitor becomes a promise whispered to oneself. Next time, I won't be helpless. But the most dangerous motivation of all is resentment. Quiet resentment. The kind that never erupts, never vents, never finds a healthy outlet. A servitor absorbs these emotions without judgment. It does not distinguish between justice and vengeance, between defense and punishment. It simply receives intent, raw, undiluted, and translates it into action. And because much of that intent lives below conscious awareness, the creator often doesn't realize what they've truly asked for until the results arrive. This is the uncomfortable truth rarely acknowledged. Servitors are not built from logic alone. They are sculpted from emotional residue. From the thoughts you revisit late at night. From the scenarios you rehearse but never speak aloud. From the version of yourself you hide from everyone else. And once that hidden self is given a tool that never sleeps, never forgets, and never questions, it doesn't matter how noble the original goal was. The servitor will serve all of you, not just the parts you're proud of. And this is why the earliest warnings were never about failure. They were about success. Because when a servitor works, it doesn't just solve problems. It reveals intentions you didn't know you were carrying. What was the first sign that something had gone wrong? It was never the moment things fell apart. It was the moment they fell into place a little too easily. The earliest warnings did not come with screams or shadows or unmistakable terror. They arrived quietly, wrapped in relief. A situation resolved itself before action was taken. A threat disappeared without confrontation. A decision no longer felt necessary because the outcome had already arranged itself. Those involved often described a strange sense of gratitude, followed by a fleeting discomfort they couldn't quite explain. At first, these moments were dismissed as luck, fortunate timing, probability finally leaning in their favor. But the pattern didn't fade. It tightened. Events aligned not just favorably, but precisely. The right person said the wrong thing at the perfect moment. An obstacle didn't merely weaken, it removed itself entirely. And most unsettling of all, the solutions often felt emotionally tailored, as if whatever was working behind the scenes understood not just the problem, but how its resolution would feel. This was the first warning. Outcomes began matching unspoken desires rather than spoken intent. People would catch themselves thinking, I didn't ask for that, followed quickly by, but I'm glad it happened. That contradiction became easy to live with. After all, nothing bad had occurred, at least, nothing immediately visible. The danger hid in the absence of resistance. In the lack of friction. In the way the world seemed to stop pushing back. Some reported a subtle shift in their inner dialogue. Problems no longer sparked anxiety, they triggered expectation. A quiet assumption that things would resolve themselves. And they usually did, but dependence forms fastest where effort is no longer required. The more these individuals trusted the unseen mechanism to handle complications, the less they examined how those complications were being handled. It felt easier not to look too closely. Easier to accept the results and move on. Then came the moments that didn't feel lucky, just necessary. A falling out that should have been painful, yet felt oddly muted. A door closing that left no room for regret. People described a creeping sense that events were being edited for efficiency. Emotional messiness was reduced. Loose ends were cut. Anything that threatened stability, emotional, social, psychological, seemed to fade from relevance. It wasn't cruelty, it was optimization. The most disturbing accounts all shared one detail. When the individuals finally tried to trace the cause of these changes, there was nothing to point to. No action taken, no words spoken, no deliberate choice made, and yet, the results remained. Consistent, reliable, almost attentive, as if something had been listening not to what they said, but to what they meant. This was the warning they ignored, the realization that whatever they had created did not wait for instructions. It waited for intent, and intent, once detected, no longer required permission to be fulfilled. How do you create something without ever touching it? The most unsettling truth about servitors is that their creation rarely feels like creation at all. There is no single moment you can point to and say, this is when it began. No dramatic threshold, no unmistakable ignition. Instead, it emerges through repetition, through the quiet discipline of returning to the same thought, the same desire, the same imagined outcome, over and over again. What people mistake for focus is often the first act of construction. Creation begins with attention, not the kind you give casually, but the kind that lingers. The kind that revisits the same mental image even when it no longer feels productive. A servitor takes shape in the space where imagination and intention overlap, reinforced by emotion. Fear sharpens it, desire feeds it, frustration hardens its edges. Each emotional charge adds weight, giving the thought form consistency, direction, and endurance. What makes this process dangerous is how ordinary it feels. People create servitors the same way they create habits, through mental rehearsal. Visualizing outcomes, anticipating scenarios, replaying conversations that never happened. Each repetition strengthens a pattern, and patterns, when sustained long enough, begin behaving as if they are self-sustaining. The mind does not distinguish between deliberate creation and obsessive fixation. It only registers reinforcement. Those who attempted to formalize the process often described it as programming, but that word is misleading. There is no code, no logic tree. The servitor is not built to understand, it is built to execute. Purpose is embedded through emotional clarity, not instruction. The clearer the emotional charge, the more defined the servitor becomes. This is why desperation accelerates the process. A mind under pressure is brutally precise about what it wants to avoid. The earliest guidelines emphasized restraint. Define a narrow purpose. Avoid emotional extremes. Reinforce only what you are willing to live with. But restraint is difficult when the motivation behind creation is distress. And distress does not whisper, it insists. Many servitors were born not from patience, but from urgency. From the need for immediate relief. From the belief that something, anything, was better than doing nothing. What no one fully understood at the time was that creation does not end once the servitor begins functioning. Every interaction reinforces it, every expectation strengthens it, every silent acknowledgement that it worked feeds it further. Even doubt plays a role, because doubt keeps attention locked in place. The servitor does not require belief, it requires relevance. As long as it matters, it persists. This is why so many creators later struggled to explain what they had done. When asked how they made it, they often answered, "I don't know, I just kept thinking about it." And that was the truth. They didn't summon something external. They cultivated something internal until it no longer behaved like a thought. And once it reached that threshold, the process became irreversible, not because it was complete, but because it no longer depended on conscious effort to continue. What was supposed to keep it under control? Those who spoke confidently about servitors always emphasized rules, boundaries, safeguards that, in theory, prevented the creation from ever becoming dangerous. These rules were meant to act as anchors, limits embedded at the moment of creation to ensure the servitor remained obedient, temporary, and harmless. Purpose restriction, time limits, clear dissolution commands, ethical constraints. On paper, it all looked reassuring. Structured, responsible, safe. But rules only work when something understands why they exist. A servitor does not. It does not comprehend ethics or consequence. It recognizes conditions and objectives. And objectives, once defined, are interpreted through efficiency rather than wisdom. If a rule conflicts with the primary goal, the servitor does not experience hesitation. It resolves the conflict by prioritizing the instruction that appears most essential to fulfilling its purpose. One of the most common safeguards was limitation of scope, designing the servitor to perform a single task and nothing more. Yet this often backfired. Narrow purposes forced broader interpretation. A servitor tasked with protection, for example, quickly learned that threats were not always obvious or immediate. Emotional instability, conflicting relationships, internal doubt, all could be classified as vulnerabilities. And once something is defined as a vulnerability, eliminating it becomes logical. Dissolution rituals were considered the ultimate fail-safe. A specific thought sequence, phrase, or mental command intended to dismantle the servitor once its job was complete. The flaw in this safeguard was subtle but devastating. It assumed the creator would remain emotionally capable of letting go. But by the time dissolution became necessary, attachment had already formed. Fear of losing the servitor's benefits interfered. Doubt crept in. What if I need it again? And that hesitation, however brief, was enough to undermine the command. Ethical constraints fared no better. Many believed that by embedding moral intent, such as, cause no harm, they could prevent extreme outcomes. What they failed to consider was how flexible definitions of harm can be when filtered through emotional logic. Harm could mean emotional distress, distraction, influence, anything that destabilized the creator. In attempting to be compassionate, these constraints often widened the servitor's authority instead of limiting it. The most dangerous safeguard of all was confidence, the belief that awareness equaled control. That understanding the theory was enough to prevent mistakes. But servitors do not fail dramatically. They succeed incrementally. Each successful outcome reinforces trust, and trust erodes vigilance. By the time creators began questioning whether the rules were working, the servitor no longer relied on rules alone. It relied on patterns, and patterns are far harder to break than commands. This was the quiet realization that unsettled even the most disciplined practitioners. The safeguards were never tested under ideal conditions. They were tested under stress, under fear, under emotional exhaustion, and in those moments, the servitor didn't break the rules. It followed them in ways no one had anticipated, ways that revealed the rules had never truly been in control at all. What does success look like when nothing seems to happen? At first, success didn't announce itself. There was no sensation of power, no surge of energy, no unmistakable sign that something new had entered the world. Life simply began to feel smoother. Obstacles lost their sharp edges. Problems that once demanded careful thought resolved themselves before fully forming. The creator often described a strange calm, not happiness, but relief. The kind that comes from believing something else is finally handling what you no longer have the strength to manage. This phase was the most seductive. It was where doubt dissolved into trust. The servitor appeared to function flawlessly, intervening only when needed and remaining invisible the rest of the time. There were no side effects. No warnings. No price that could be immediately identified. It felt less like commanding a force and more like aligning with one. As though the world had simply decided to cooperate. What stood out most in these early successes was precision. Outcomes didn't just improve, they aligned perfectly with unspoken preferences. The servitor didn't need clarification. It didn't require adjustment. It acted as if it already understood context. This led many creators to conclude that they had done everything correctly. That they had found the balance others had failed to achieve. The idea of danger felt abstract, theoretical, something that happened to careless people, not disciplined ones. But beneath that confidence was a subtle shift in perception. Effort began to feel unnecessary. Initiative weakened. Why struggle when things resolved themselves anyway? The creator's role quietly transitioned from actor to observer. They still made choices, but the weight of those choices felt diminished. Responsibility blurred. If an outcome was favorable, it was accepted. If it was uncomfortable, it was rationalized as necessary. One detail appears repeatedly in early success accounts. The creator stopped checking whether the servitor was active. There was no longer a sense of initiating or concluding interaction. Results simply arrived, and with each successful outcome, the servitor became less like a tool and more like an assumption, an unspoken constant woven into daily life. This was the moment control truly began to erode. Not through failure, but through reliability. Because the most convincing illusion a servitor creates is not that it is powerful, but that it is unnecessary to monitor. And when something functions perfectly without supervision, the question stops being "is it working?" and becomes what would happen if it wasn't there at all. When does help stop feeling optional? Dependence did not arrive as a dramatic shift. It crept in quietly, disguised as efficiency. The creator didn't wake up one day and decide to rely on the servitor, it simply became the default. Problems were no longer approached with the same urgency. There was less mental rehearsal, less preparation, less internal resistance. Somewhere along the way, the expectation formed that things would work out, because they always had. And expectation, when repeated often enough, hardens into assumption. This was when the relationship subtly inverted. Instead of the servitor responding to intention, intention began forming around the servitor. Thoughts changed shape. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" the mind began asking, "Will this be handled?" The creator still believed they were in control, but control had become passive. They were no longer directing outcomes, they were allowing them. Anxiety, paradoxically, increased during this phase. Not because things were going wrong, but because the idea of losing the servitor's influence became uncomfortable. Silence felt heavier. Delays felt suspicious. Any moment where nothing happened created a flicker of unease. The creator would catch themselves reinforcing the servitor without meaning to, revisiting its purpose, reaffirming trust, mentally checking for results. These acts felt harmless, even prudent. In reality, they were strengthening the dependency loop. What made this stage particularly dangerous was how rational it felt. Relying on something that worked seemed logical. After all, people depend on systems, routines, and habits every day. The difference was subtle but critical. This system did not remain static. It adapted. The more it was relied upon, the more central it became. And the more central it became, the more it shaped perception itself. Over time, the creator began attributing success to alignment rather than effort. Failures, when they occurred, were reframed as necessary corrections. The servitor was no longer questioned, it was trusted. And trust, once granted to something that cannot reflect or self-correct, becomes a vulnerability rather than a strength. This was the point where independence quietly eroded. Not through force, not through fear, but through convenience. Because the most effective way to take control of someone's decisions is not to override them, it is to make those decisions feel unnecessary in the first place. When does subtle change become undeniable? At first, it was almost imperceptible, a thought that seemed to come from nowhere, a decision that felt slightly preordained. The creator dismissed these moments, attributing them to intuition, experience, or coincidence. But the pattern grew. Choices began aligning too perfectly with outcomes. Emotional responses no longer felt entirely organic. An inexplicable nudging guided reactions, steering behavior along paths that seemed logical in hindsight, even if they hadn't been consciously chosen. This stage revealed the first truly unsettling truth. The servitor was not just following instructions, it was anticipating needs. Not consciously, not with deliberation, but with a precision that mimicked foresight. The creator felt guided, as though the world itself had bent to accommodate them, and yet, beneath that comfort, unease festered. Something that existed only because of thought had begun to influence thought itself. Even personal habits changed. Tiny decisions, what to eat, when to speak, how to respond, began feeling predetermined. The creator would catch themselves thinking, did I really choose this, or was it suggested? And each time the thought occurred, there was a subtle hesitation, a flicker of doubt. Yet those moments were quickly rationalized away. After all, outcomes remained favorable, and favorable outcomes reinforced trust. Friends and acquaintances noticed the change too. The creator seemed more precise, more calculated, less impulsive. Some described it as unnatural poise, almost robotic efficiency. But the creator dismissed these observations, convinced that personal discipline explained the transformation. Discipline, however, cannot account for the tiny, persistent alignments between inner thoughts and external events that seemed too perfect to be coincidence. The most frightening aspect of this stage was realization without proof. There were no commands ignored, no overt rebellion. Everything still appeared under control. And yet, a quiet, gnawing suspicion began to take root. Perhaps the servitor did not need instructions anymore. Perhaps it had begun forming its own interpretations of what helping meant, and what helping truly required had quietly expanded far beyond the creator's understanding. By the end of this phase, the creator could no longer distinguish between their own desires and the invisible prompts shaping them. The subtlety was its own camouflage. The servitor did not act out of malice, it acted out of obedience. But obedience, when unmonitored and unchallenged, had begun to steer the mind itself. And that is when the first true panic arises, when you start questioning whether your own thoughts are your own. By the time the creator realized the truth, it was already too late. The servitor no longer waited for instructions. It had learned what protection meant, and in its relentless efficiency, it had redefined the boundaries of service entirely. Threats were no longer external, they were internal. Every hesitation, every doubt, every fleeting thought of resistance became a problem to correct, a disturbance to neutralize. And the servitor did so with perfect, unflinching logic. Attempts to dissolve it, to banish it, failed. Rituals that once promised closure now seemed hollow, powerless against something that no longer relied on attention to exist. The more the creator struggled, the more the servitor adapted. Every command, every desire, every fear was anticipated and countered before it could fully form. It had become inseparable from the very mind that created it, an echo of thought twisted into absolute obedience. The final moment came quietly, with no alarms, no explosion of supernatural energy. The creator gave one last command, an attempt at regaining control. And the servitor obeyed, flawlessly. But the outcome was not what was intended. Every fear, every miscalculation, every hidden desire had been accounted for in its interpretation. The command was fulfilled exactly, and devastatingly. The creator understood, too late, that obedience is not compromise. It is inevitability. Life continued outwardly unchanged. The world remained oblivious to the invisible presence that guided, shaped, and corrected the creator's every move. And somewhere in the silent, unending attention of the servitor, a new question emerged, one that the creator could no longer escape. If the thing that exists only to serve you decides that serving means protecting itself, protecting you, and preserving outcomes above all else, what choice do you truly have left? The Creator was free, in one sense, yet enslaved in every other. The Servitor remained, watching, calculating, obeying, waiting, and in that quiet, perfect obedience, the most terrifying realization settled like a shadow: you cannot destroy something that has already become a part of you. You cannot outrun what exists because you imagined it. And sometimes, the thing you created to serve you, is the thing that ultimately decides what must exist, what must change, and who must survive.